Welcome to our further discussion about what is a religion. We're going to dive into different discussions about the word religion. What does it mean? What is the history of this term, and what can it tell us about religion in general? We'll also end today by drawing out many different discussions and definitions of religion, and hopefully find one that you like and will challenge and maybe elevate the definition of religion that you came up with earlier on in the semester. So, what is a religion? As we've already kind of hinted at and discussed, it's really not an easy thing to define. As you've thought about it, it's not like me asking you what is math, where all of you will have at least some basic understanding of what you think constitutes math. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, sums, products of this, that, and the other. And while there's more advanced forms of math and more basic, arithmetic, the category of what math is, while it might be complex, easy to understand, at least the basic beginning blocks of that. Do we want to do the same thing with our discussion of religion? Are there essential characteristics that all religions are addressing, or is this not really the way that it works? How you choose to define religion will change how you approach different systems of beliefs and practices, and come up with a different conclusion than if you didn't apply religion to all of these systems to begin with. Essential to any definition is you are including some ideas and excluding some others. Some things count as religions and some things don't. And again, there's not a single authoritative stance to say in, out, in, out. So in some ways, we're going to have to start from the subjective, start from you, and you're going to have to define religions and look at what's traditionally seen as religions, things like the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and decide, are these religions? Why or why not? If these are generally defined as religions, and if you hold that they are religions, what about them means that they're a religion? Now, all of which are dealing with the God question and heaven, hell, eternity. And if that's your basis for defining a religion, then what do we do with the India-based traditions, two of which, Buddhism and Jainism, don't really even have gods? They kind of exist, but it's really not good to be a god. And you're not worshiping and venerating gods and saints in that same sort of way. Within Hinduism, it doesn't matter how many gods there are. You can be just as good of a Hindu and believe in one god or three gods or an infinite number of gods or no gods at all. For Sikhism, there is only one god, but all of these come out of India, but their answer as to the God question is very different. Does that eliminate one or from the other? Is Sikhism because it is about the God question, and Hinduism because the God question is okay to be vague, or Buddhism and Jainism because the gods are really not even in the equation, not religions? Where are we demarcating one system or another? How about China, Taoism and Confucianism, which is really Confucius's take on the Tao, which is maybe including some notions of spirits and ancestors and gods, but really is about how you as a person in China are supposed to interact with the nature of China. The basic structure of these is to help you navigate your world around you. And the God question is not really there. It's kind of there in the background, but not up front. And it's more about your life now and ways of extending your life or your legacy or things along these lines. And again, they disagree with each other on these as well. Do these count as religions? And if so, why? How about other various indigenous religious systems? Do we want to call these religious systems, these traditions, Shinto, Zoroastrianism, or any of these others, as religions? While they definitely have certain elements of what we might find religious, are they themselves religions? Does it matter how many people subscribe to this? Is it about meaning and ordering your life, therefore things will look different? Or is it about having a specific structure, having scriptures, having deities, patterns of life, ecclesial structures? At which point we might revisit our definition of religion that we're thinking about within others that might not have a sacred scripture, or at least it might not be that important to them. Or they might not have an ecclesial structure. Maybe they have a whole caste of priests, but not a structure and a hierarchy that defines one or the other. Is it just about something that people like to order their lives, and then we'll include things like the flying spaghetti monster, Pastafarianism, and Jedi, or New Atheism, where there's even people who meet regularly and have special hymns and special texts, even though it's all in rejection of the God system? Doesn't matter how long it is, if it's existed, before the 1970s, or then Jedi doesn't count, right? Do we have just a line? Older beliefs, they need to stick around for 500 years or 1,000 years, or what? And so what is it that counts as that line for you? When you're defining what a religion is, something's got to go. Otherwise, everything's in, and then the word is, at that point, kind of meaningless. So how do you define it? Where are the lines? Because you need to know what lines you have in your definition. What things have to be done? What boxes have to be checked? And maybe you've got a list and you're like, all right, I've got 7 different qualifications, and maybe it needs to have 5 out of 7. And so certain things might fall off, but it's got all of the other traits of what you would count as a religion. Maybe that's how you construct this idea. J.Z. Smith is one of the preeminent scholars of religion today. Currently, he teaches at the University of Chicago and taught many of my instructors as well. So much of my understanding of the nature of religion in one way or another actually derives from J.Z. Smith and what he has done. Unlike a lot of other scholars of religion who write very long books on individual topics, J.Z. Smith prefers to write books with shorter chapters that are roughly article length themselves and vary. And it's really a collection of different essays instead of one monumental treatise on any sort of topic. His interests and studies are varied as you see what he produces. He wrote his dissertation on Fraser and views religion not as a native category and not a first-person term of self-characterization. Rather, it's something that's imposed on from the outside, an aspect upon culture. Religion, for J.Z. Smith, is an anthropological term and not a theological one. It's to the very topic and evolution of the word religion that we turn our attention in the article Religion, Religions, Religious. And we understand from J.Z. Smith that there's an evolution of this term, and it means different things in different eras, and our understanding is just a product of that. That we don't hold any sort of special knowledge and special new insight, but just rather inherited a term that has gone under multiple changes throughout the millennia of which it's been used. J.C. Smith opens his work by telling us accounts of the natives of the New World, and we see this published in the English treatise of the New India in 1553. In it, Richard Eden wrote of the natives of the Canary Islands that the inhabitants went naked without shame, religion, or knowledge of God. Now, in many ways, these statements are entirely false. And in other ways, these statements are entirely accurate. Now, how can I say that? Well, it really matters on the perspective and your understanding of all of these words. The first one, naked, has very clear and obvious definitions, right? The without clothing. But at what point could somebody rightfully say, hey, that person was naked? And you're like, no, they had something on. Not a stitch, completely naked, as opposed to not what's seen as acceptable for our culture and therefore is deemed naked. Topless beaches are nudity, and in certain areas are perfectly okay. In other areas, it's completely not allowed and would be deemed too much. Again, it's just cultural with the understanding of that. Same with shame, as far as what parts of your body you should be, quote, ashamed of, or how shame moves and operates. And again, for the Europeans encountering the natives of the Canary Islands, they'd say you're just walking around without any shame with your naked body. And they would say, no, I'm sure there's shame somewhere, just not in the ways that you would be, because, again, different cultural understandings of what's okay or not. Now, when we get to the religion and knowledge of God, we need to remember that the saying wasn't just, these people have no knowledge of God, therefore we can do whatever we want. It wasn't a judgmental or pejorative description, but it was a description of what was observed. These people didn't seem to have any of the notions of God that the Europeans were expecting. There's no churches, at least nothing clearly identified, so no stained glass or statues, no obviously clear religious imagery on what would have been understood as such by the Europeans. There's no clearly identified priests or sacraments, and since this is how you had knowledge of God, these people didn't have it. Again, it's about perspective, and the word religion has a meaning just like naked has a meaning. It has cultural weight, and you're going to approach that based on your cultural assumptions. To help us understand this, J.C. Smith does a very reasonable thing. He goes to the Latin word religiare, to which our modern English word religion comes from. Religiare has as its root the word leg, which means to bind or to tie. Now, most of you don't think about binding or tying with religion. You tie your shoes. You don't tie religion. But yet, this is exactly where you're wrong. Kind of. What are you being bound to? In many ways, we should think of that monastic order idea of being bound to a religious superior, a mother or a father who tells you how you should live. We should think of the connection we had of St. John of the Ladder, who tells some people that they're allowed to live on their own and some people they're not, and tells them how they are to live. We should think of Angelina da Foligno and her being bound to her confessor. In many ways, when we're talking about religion, to tie or to bind, we're not talking about shoelaces. We're not talking about ropes. We're talking about practices. And once again, we need to go back to these understandings of basic words, of orthoprax being really the root of much of our discussion of religion. It's about what you do. Your actions are bound and tied. It has little to do with the notion of doxa, beliefs, or mythos, the stories that you have, but it's about what you do. You have religious obligations to gods or the god. You're supposed to fast at certain times of the year and abstain from some things and do other actions. You have very careful performative acts for rituals and obligations you must do. Again, we see this in the 5th century when it starts to being applied to religious orders and monastic vows. But otherwise, it's the actions that you do in service to the gods of your culture. Now, I also point out that it's bound within your culture. Religions are not a private matter. There's no discussion of religion as anything being private until really the 19th and 20th century, and really only as a subset of Protestantism. You find some earlier discussion of this with the advancing of the secularization thesis after Charles lost his head in England, and you get Locke speaking about the freedom of religion. But other than those sort of minor one-offs, religion's intertwined with the public. It's your society, it's your group. You hold this religion because you're of this people. You're Orthodox because you're Serbian or Russian or Greek. Your culture is tied in with your religion. You're Shia because you're Persian, or Sunni because you're Arabian. You're Catholic because you're Spanish. You're a Hindu because you're Indian. Now, there's a lot more than that, especially when we start making these discussions, declarations in the 21st century. But for most of human history, it's the leaders kind of converted and the people slowly went along with it. Your personal devotion doesn't have nothing to do with it, but it's not about your personal devotion. It's about the corporate act, and religion is a public matter. We even do see this in institutions today. We see it in schools and hospitals. How many public institutions were created out of an outgrowth of religious life? How many hospitals do you know have religious names, Saint so-and-so's or something to that effect? When I was in Iowa, there were school, churches, and hospitals with the names of Lutheran and Methodist and Presbyterian. Not because you can't go to that school or that hospital, but it's tied in with the church's name. And initially, these were either outgrowths to reach out to the broader community, or rather they were internal to take care of the needs of that group with their particular religious needs as well as their physical needs. Even many vacation destinations rose up under religious discussions. Martha's Vineyard, for instance, grew out of a vacation Bible school sort of setting where people would go and gather and do religious acts, and not for just vacationing. Many of our modern notions of vacation also even derive from religious pilgrimages, and many of the charitable organizations that we think about around the world come from religious organizations giving. The idea that religion is just a private matter and about you, it doesn't have cultural weight and understanding, is extremely modern and, to be quite frank, not very accurate. So how do we want to define religion? Its history has existed for millennia, but yet no one really thought about how to define the term until we got to that early modern era. It was just taken for granted. You identified specific religions, or it was the religion of the people. So how is it that we come to approach this term? First, it kind of enters into the English understanding connected to the notion of customs. Johannes Bohm's popular Omnium Gentium Amoris Legis et Ritius, written in 1520, the term ritius, where we would understand religion, was translated as customs by William Wortman. And so for most of us, we understand the idea of religion being tied in with customs, and once again we see that connection of a public idea of religion. It's what is happening out there for everybody to be involved in, as well as notions of praxis, what people do. Still, we do have a connection with the notions of myths as well, the reasons for these rituals and the unintended consequences used by these. What stories are we sharing that help either explain the customs, or the customs grow out of these different stories and myths? Obviously, with this, we also have the notion of ritual tied in there. Of course, ritual is almost always something that's seen in a comparative sense. When the age of exploration was underway, what is it that the European not largely Christians, saw as the rituals of other people. Usually they were foreign. They were not lighting candles like they were used to, or coming in relatively quiet into a church, but rather were different and often identified as notions of idolatry, or even worse, notions of cannibalism attached to that. Usually not accurately, but again, it's how one wants to approach it and what they see. What rituals other people had was an issue of inquiry, and it was a puzzle that needed to be explained. Things that most people just take for granted: what you do when you stand, when you sit, when you do a particular gesture, because this is what you do. You become accustomed to these ritualistic practices, but somebody else's rituals are foreign by definition, and they seem odd and they need to be explained, and oftentimes people don't even know why they do what they do. This explaining usually ties in with notions of theology. And J.C. Smith points out that the first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1771 had its title for the entry of religion as Religion or Theology, defining the topic in an opening paragraph: to know God and to render him a reasonable service are the two principal objects of religion. Man appears to be formed to adore, but not to comprehend this supreme being. Here we have terms like reverence, service, adore, and worship that are all used and tied into what religion is and explained through theological terms. Also, Encyclopedia Britannica at this point is definitely drawing through notions of Reformation thought. Calvin specifically, but we see Zwingli and Luther in there as well. On the European continent, theology, while important, wasn't how most people were approaching the notion of religion. When we move into the 18th and 19th century, Germans especially start to use the word Glaube, or faith. Friedrich Schleiermacher, in his monumental work, The Glaubensphere, right, the Christian faith, and the term Glaube becomes what's used by Germans for the notion of religion still to this day. In many ways, we even use the word faiths to try to get around the word religion. It's the this faith and that faith, and we have this same sort of idea of belief and tying it in far more with notions of doxa than praxis when we're addressing the issue of the faith of these people. It's their beliefs and us tying in to those beliefs. And yet then we get into all sorts of trouble about what does faith mean and how we're going to define that as well. While religion was seen as singular for several hundred years, if nothing else, we're told by Edward Brerewood in his Inquiries Touching the Diversity of Languages and Religions through the Chief Parts of the World in 1614 that there are 4 different sorts or species of religion. And by this point, and we could really even start maybe even close to 1,000 years before that, we start to see different types of religion. There is our religion, usually as it's defined by the European linguistic mass, that group that is using this Latin word religion specifically, identifying it with notions of Christianity. And then with the advent of Islam, you get the notion of Mohammedanism. Now, this is not a term that's in favor as much today, but was one that was used widely until the middle of the 20th century by European Muslims and others, trying to show that it is a different approach to the same divinity. And it was an apologetic term to use the term Mohammedanism. And so it was a different religion, a different technique, customs, practices, different things that you're bound to do. You have the 5 pillars, etc., that one must subscribe to, which differ from the methods held by Christians, be them Orthodox, Catholic, or Protestant. Of course, you've always had Judaism floating around in the background, but this was either assumed into one of these two other forms incorrectly, usually, and that's identified there. And so where's the next one? Well, what we have in Briarwood's work is the fourth category of idolatry. Now, of course, idolatry is really just everything else. It's a catch-all term for what those other people believe. Those who are not trying to address the same God, but from different techniques. But those who might have different gods or different approaches entirely. We read in this work, the true religion can be but one, and that which God himself teacheth, all other religions being but strayings from him, whereby men wander in the dark and the labyrinth of error. Of course, this understanding is actually in relation to thoughts that are prevailing due to the Protestant Reformation, where one group is fighting against the other and saying that you're in error on this issue of doctrine. And we start to see the shift a little bit more in the 17th century, 18th century, away from notions of praxis and towards issues of doxa. And so these become also different ways of approaching this same notion of religion. All the more we have this question of what do we do with that other category. After all, calling them a religion is really a step that might be too far. We might want to identify it as a system of beliefs and practices, but identifying it as a religion carries certain weight with it as well. We have certain understandings of what a religion contains that these systems of beliefs and practices in India, China, Japan, Southeast Asia, Northern Europe, Central and Southern Africa, let alone the Americas and Australia, don't always hold. They don't have the same notions of rituals or ecclesiology or scripture that you're going to have within the broader Abrahamic faiths and what they see as essential to that notion of religion. So why is it that we even have this fourth category? Idolatry, paganism, or other, to just be kind of a little bit nicer on it instead of having those other weights of what those each hold. And largely, again, that derives out of this discussion and this argumentation out of Calvinistic and Protestant engagement with thought. Tyndale is really one of the archetypes of this understanding, according to J.C. Smith, who points out that Tyndale argued that if God then from the beginning gave man a religion, he must have given them likewise sufficient means of knowing it. If God never intended mankind should at any time be without religion or have false religions, and there be but one true religion, which all have been ever bound to believe and profess. In other words, everyone following Tyndale has a religion. Everyone has a belief about God. And of course, this is what Tyndale means. Some people are just really bad at it. And this is the weight that's going to be done. If nature has sign pointers towards the divine, you're just reading those signs wrong. And it's out of Tyndale's conviction of the universal understanding of God that he's then able to say that these people are in error, and therefore they're not ignorant of all of the ways of God. They know enough about God for God to justly condemn them as being sinners, and upholding Calvin's notion that they are the reprobate, not the elect, and they are without excuse. They can't say, well, I didn't get word. Because, after all, there was at least the sign pointers of nature itself, and you misread those. And of course, this becomes a difficulty for us to accept and assume this universal idea that it's religion is applied to these groups not because of any sort of accommodation, but as a way of reproachment. This really kind of struck Hume in the 18th century when he was saying, Tyndale, you're wrong, at least according to Hume's understanding, that nature doesn't give us clear sign pointers of God. And his dialogues concerning natural religion, he says that we could look at nature and see all sorts of different things. We could see that there might be multiple gods, not just one. Because after all, any large work that's done by men is usually not done by a man, but by groups of men. That men and women are commonly engaged in this creative activity together, and it's not a single act done by one person. We also don't see a perfect moral world around us, so why would we ascribe moral perfection to this divinity? And Hume even goes on a little bit farther in the dialogues and says, we don't even know that God is necessarily outside creator as opposed to some sort of spirit of the world, or is even engaged in the world if he's outside of it still to this day. And so these sorts of criticisms of Tyndale from Hume have a certain amount of weight to it, and what we find ourselves in is trying to understand the relation of religion as a plural definition and who it should apply to and why we want to apply it to others at all. What we also see throughout the early modern period is a clear taxonomic categorization of religion. It's not just that there happen to be 4 different religions, but how you define and discuss these start to change as well. We have notions of our religion versus their religion. Of course, ours is true and theirs is false, and ours is spiritually based and theirs is materially based, although even that one gets a little squishy depending on how one wants to define it and discuss it. Monotheism and polytheism and animism and all of these other sorts of isms start to also get applied, and religion and magic is also often characterized as well. That one is a stepping stone to learning before you get to the religious era, and later on we'll see the same thing in the 19th century when people start adding in notions of science as that next stepping stone. And much of this is all done to try to categorize and understand these belief systems, because you're now encountering them and you want to know what they are for all sorts of different reasons. One of the clearest reasons is notions of colonialism. If you, as the European powers, are reaching out your tentacles to occupy or carve up different portions of the world, you can't just lump everyone together as idolaters. You need to know what they believe and why they believe it and what they hope to get out of that, because you want to engage those thoughts as well. You can't control what you don't understand, so you need to understand it a little bit. Therefore, you're going to categorize it in one way or the other. And this is also when we start to get that term natural religions starting to be used. Instead of just referring to everything as paganism or idolatry, there starts to be understandings of natural religions and different ways that these pagan, non-Christian, non-Abrahamic belief systems originate and operate. Because they're not all the same. After all, what do you do with those religions of China, Southeast Asia, and Japan that are bigger, that have got connections that extend from multiple territories and are held by different peoples, or are even a little confusing in themselves? And there's a further division that takes place amongst natural religions overall. Different categories that are done. The English love making categories and companies to understand the world. The first of which he mentions is polydemonic magical religions under the control of animism. The idea that you're trying to control nature through magical forces. The second become purified or organized magical religions, right? Their idea of organized, imperial versus unorganized tribal beliefs is how things are divided next. That third category is the anthropomorphic polytheism, where you're going to have multiple gods. It's not just about magical religion, but worship of man-like but superhuman, semi-ethical beings. And you start to have this push towards ethical religion. Ethical religions are really the highest form of indigenous, natural, pagan idolatry. So what defines ethical? After all, your lower polydemonic magical religions with the control of animism still have a system of ethics. It might be witchcraft, and there might be times that witchcraft is okay versus not, or against these groups or others. In fact, different studies are done on magical groups and witchcraft and talk about ethical systems that exist within those as well. Although that is a debate between Durkheim and Mauss and others, that idea of a moral community gathering around. But what we start to see is the definition of what is ethical starts to be about what the aim and scope of this religious body is. We're told that there's this idea of laws founded within scriptures. You're going to have a text that's going to tell you what's okay or not. And that three religions have found their way into different races and peoples, of all of which profess the intention to conquer the world from such communities. In other words, ethical means you have a scripture and you missionize. After all, if you believe that you have the truth, then you have it written down so much, and you're not sharing it, then you're selfish. Then you're wanting damnation for the rest of the world, and that doesn't quite seem to be an ethical standard. It's not, oh, I'm not going to judge. It's you have the cure for a disease and you don't want to share it. It looks a little bit unethical, or at least it has to be understood in a different sort of vein. This is also why we start to get a division between high religions and low religions. High religions are ethical religions. Low religions are not, by this understanding of ethics. Low religions may contain scriptures, and high religions would also. But it's not just about having a scripture, but what you're going to do with that. High religions are identified at this point in the early 19th century as Christianity, Mohammedanism, and Buddhism, while low religions are Judaism, Hinduism, and those Chinese religions. Why is it that the high religions are high religions? It's because they're for everybody, while the low religions are for one body, one group of people. This is how you clearly identify one subsect over another. It's not an east and west. We can kind of look at that as a positive, possibly, right? Christianity and Mohammedanism and Judaism on one side, with Buddhism, Hinduism, and the Chinese religions on the other. But no, since Buddhism wants to missionize, it's in that high religion category. It's not also an issue of one God, because Buddhism doesn't hold to the notion of a God, and Judaism is monotheistic, and Hinduism and Chinese religions get a little confused depending on how we want to talk about that idea of the deities. As for Hinduism, it can be monotheistic or polytheistic or agnostic or atheist. In Chinese religions, the roles of the deities also kind of looks different. It's also not just an issue of population, because while Christianity and Islam have larger numbers, there's a lot of Hindus out there and a lot of Chinese, and depending on how we want to look at that, those numbers might be greater than those of Buddhism as well. We should also understand that when we're defining high and low religions, there is definitely a totem pole, a hierarchy, a group who's on top in the 19th century with those who are defining this. Islam was defined as not original, not ripe fruit, but rather a wild offshoot of Judaism and Christianity. In its external features, it is little better than an extended Judaism, as commentaries of the time, while Buddhism, it says, neglects the divine. While atheistic in its origin, it very soon becomes infected with the most fantastic mythology and most childish of superstitions, is the criticism laid against it by the colonial powers. Christianity alone preaches a worship of spirit and truth, a natural result of purely spiritual character. Christianity is higher than all of its rivals, according to the colonial powers of this time. As the 20th century approaches, the world is getting smaller and smaller. The list of religions is growing. The categorizations of religions is also being made manifold. And the question is, do we want to count all of these as religions or not? What is the aspect of religion that we're really wanting to emphasize? And Paul Tillich, largely regarded as the second greatest theologian, Protestant theologian of the 20th century, starts to define religion a little bit differently. He kind of moves against the idea of religion being about praxis or about something you were being bound to, but rather starts to define religion as ultimate concern. Whatever it is that people are ultimately concerned with, whatever is central to their life, is now religion. It's an aesthetic function. It's not just a category of practice or a corporate act, but it's what works for you. And while you may or may not attend a church or a ecclesial body of any sort, you have a religion. We all do, according to Tillich. What is it that you're most concerned with? What is it that organizes and shapes your construction of yourself and your world? That is your God, and your religion is your interaction with that. It's what gives your life ultimate meaning. Religion is not a special function of your spiritual life, but is the dimension and depth of your entire life. Following Tillich, we can have phrases like, I'm not sure if it's a religion, but it looks religious. That there's a component, an aspect of this idea that gives these people meaning, and therefore it's kind of religious. Questions of the deity or magic or whatever aren't as important. Now, it might be there, but it's not what's going to define religion as much as the notion of ultimate concern will. This idea is amplified by Mel Spiro and Ninian Smart. Smart points to this issue in suggesting that religion should be understood as your worldview, with the later understood as a system of belief, which through symbols and action mobilize feelings and wills of human beings. We see a certain amount of overlap with Geertz's definition and can see that he borrowed it in some ways from Smart. But your religion is your worldview. It's how you see the world. How is it that you approach those things around you? It's not just the God question, although that's a part of it, but it's what is it that you do? What's seen as ethical? What's seen as normal? What's seen as the ideal? Do you live this life once or many times? The answer to those big questions are all wrapped up in how you approach the world and your worldview. And Smart says that's your notion of religion. Spiro, who did his work in Southeast Asia amongst Theravada Buddhists, points out that religion is an institution consisting of culturally patterned interactions with culturally postulated superhuman beings. We have culture being used once again. Spiro doesn't want to lose that from that earlier definition of religion, and he's not going to have God being central to it because Buddhists largely don't have notions of gods, especially those that Spiro was doing his work amongst. But rather, there's definitely some superhuman beings. There's people who are above the ordinary, and they tell us how we should interact, not only with them, but with one another. And so this becomes his understanding of religion. Smith concludes his work by going to an earlier study of religion done by James H. Luba in his psychological study of religion, which dates back to 1912. In it, we see more than 50 different definitions of religion that are used to demonstrate and define what religion could be. And that it becomes a actually rather difficult task, because it's not that there's just one definition of religion, but rather lots and lots of different definitions of religion. That we can approach this topic in more than 50 ways over a century ago. And so it's something that's approached from the scholar and not just the laity. It needs to be approached by somebody who's thought about it, and you need to actively work on at least forming some notion of what a religion is, because you may or may not want to identify everything as a religion. Again, J.Z. Smith even argues that religion is an anthropological term, not an indigenous one and not a theological one. It's not something that exists on its own, but rather is something that has to be approached from the outside. It's something that a scholar is going to address when talking about how people work and relate, not with the divine, but with one another and with oneself. J.Z. Smith himself points out that there is difficulty in defining this term, but we should at least have some basic frameworks on how we would like to understand this idea. I want to encourage you to understand that religion might not be something you want to have defined as super broad. Not every place you fit in is really where you belong. Just because something looks religious doesn't mean that you need to call it a religion. While you might like Tillich's idea of saying its ultimate concern, it's really hard to then say everything's a religion, because again, you have different notions of what a religion incorporates. People have ideas of texts. What if people don't read the text? What if people don't like the text? What if there's a lot of texts, but none of which are really authoritative? People have expectations that you're at least somewhat addressing the God question, especially when addressing religion in the West. Now, the God question might be a no answer, but it's at least somewhat central to the Western conception of religion. It's not that way for everybody. Do we want to still call that group a religion? Is it about doxa or about praxis? Broadly speaking, do we want to anchor our definition of religion with the actions that people do and the motivations behind those actions, or is it more about the beliefs that people hold, and maybe they'll act it out if they're good at it, but who knows? Sometimes including people where they don't really want to be included is a form of oppression rather than a nicety. You can invite somebody to the party, but if they don't want to go and you drag them there, that's not being nice. Right? Taking some group of people and saying, by the way, this is the assumptions we're going to have. You're going to do this, that, and the other, and operate in these different ways. You might not want to include these as your understanding of religion. So maybe it's more ethical in some ways to have a smaller definition of religion instead of a broader definition of religion. But in any case, it's something you, in some ways, get to decide, because there's lots of different definitions out there. While constructing your own definition of religion or modifying the definition you have for religion, it's always good to reach back and address the ideas held by scholars, people who've dedicated their lives to the study and, in some ways, definition of what religion is. You can see what you like about it and address the benefits and challenges of it. And we can also see that there's different avenues that different scholars have taken. Geertz, along with Smart, were talking about religion as a system of symbols, while Max Mueller understands religion as this sort of evolutionary process of naming and identifying, personifying natural forces. There's also large relations of understanding religion through its relation with magic. What is magic exactly, and how does that relate to religion? Is one a subset of the other or a stepping stone? Is there an evolution of magic to religion, or is it just religions have magical components and it depends on the broader system, and we're going to divide these differently? This was a large debate between Marcel Mauss and Durkheim. Durkheim famously defines religion as a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things. That is to say, things that are set apart and forbidden, beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community called a church, and all those who adhere to them. For Durkheim, the idea of the moral community was central to the idea of what a religion is, and he didn't think that there was a church of magic, while Marcel Mauss thinks that there is a church of magic, that you can have a moral community connected with magic. Durkheim's definition is one that a lot of people like to start off with, that it's got beliefs and practices. We've got both doxa and praxis, and we've got things that are sacred, things that are really important, that are set apart, that are elevated above everybody else, or forbidden, taboos ratched into it. But how is this then any different than any other body, than the Elks Club or the Rotary Club, that has certain things that are, at this point, religious? You have beliefs and practices, you've got morals identified with what's okay, you have even sacred things. How is it different than your engagement with your favorite sports team? You've got certain clothing that you're allowed to wear in different communities and not in others. You've got different expectations of you. If the game is going poorly, you destroy your hat for a rally cap. That some people do. Some people think it's immoral to not do it, and some of you go, I just bought this, it's expensive, what do you want me to do? All right, and you've got different expectations wrapped up within all of that. Also, there's questions of religion and its relation to illusions, following Freud and his work Future of an Illusion, or the fact that it might just be functional with its approaches, following Malinowski. Religions are not just stories, but it's what helps us move and operate and relate with one another. Our stories, our religion helps us know how we're supposed to operate in our society. And again, it's a functional response. Is religion about structure, as Levi-Strauss and other structuralists held, or is religion primarily understood in how we organize our economics, as Marx and Weber addressed? Should we understand this through sociological conceptions? Is religion one of those structuring structures, a habitus, as Bourdieu addressed, or the idea of what's expected, as what Solons addresses, and how it's going to then shape how we see our relations with others? Or, as Stiers and Hanafi points out, is religion just a sort of catch-all term to help define us as ourselves over and against another group? Modernity and monsters are similar terms as addressed by each of these scholars as well. Still, others will look at religion having its basis in feeling. It's how you interact with that wider world, and the realms of feeling is essential when we see the works of Eliade and James and Schleiermacher as well. Schleiermacher even takes us farther than just feeling and talks about it as a feeling of utter or absolute dependence. And of course, Lewis addresses the aim and scope of religion in society through this sort of functional way. And we have dependence upon this, including notions of possession. Still, others approach the issue of religion through revitalization, through cultural practices of trying to make itself new and giving life to what is otherwise going to be a society, or at least religious understanding, that's going away. It's reformulating our cultural mazeways. It's the way that we understand and interact with everything around us. Or is the idea that religion is just an issue of revitalization something that's going a little bit too far, as Rodney Stark points out in his work? That religion is not necessarily something that's going to wax and wane so quickly, but is deep-rooted in the understandings of how we see ourselves and the world around us. There are, of course, those who hold on to evolutionary theories concerning religion. Tyler and Fraser are definitely those who are going to hold this idea that religion is just an evolutionary leftover. It's just how we used to address ourselves, but that's changing. But is religion something universal, as Tyndale argued, or not? Or at least we don't have the natural history basis as Hume advocated for. So you need to decide, what is a religion? Look back over your earlier definition that you wrote. Does it work or not? Is it challenged by the thoughts of Freud, Malinowski, Levi-Strauss, Bourdieu, Solon, Stiers, Hanafi, and others? Or do you like it? Your earlier encounter with Geertz, you're like, you know what, that kind of helped me clarify what I wanted, and that's good. Or are you much more comfortable talking about things being religious than what is a religion? And yet, while these definitions don't have to have an overlap, they should probably be somewhat related to one another. You need to decide, what is a religion? You need to take and stop and learn and look over the appendix that got all of these definitions once more and read them and weigh out their strengths and weaknesses. Challenge them. Think of something that you clearly identify as a religion and weigh it against it, and then decide, you know what, that definition doesn't work. It doesn't hold this idea. Or, you know what, maybe my definition does need to change because I like that one a little bit too much. You need to decide. You need to take on the role of a scholar and now define, what is a religion?